Well, here's a question that was exercising quite a few minds over the weekend. In fact, we think it's such a good question, we'll use it today. Did Tony Blair deserve his knighthood? Many think not. More than, I think it's 400,000, I'm told. 400,000 Britons have now signed a petition to argue for his award to be rescinded. According to Nick Timothy, once himself a former advisor to Prime Minister Theresa May, the Blair knighthood is a reminder of how the former Labour Prime Minister remains an influential figure in the life of the nation. Well, Nick Timothy joins me now, I'm delighted to say. Nick, thanks ever so much for your time. Do appreciate it. Your essential point is that he never really went away.
No, I mean, he's been ever present, hasn't he? And he's still winding people up from left to right. I think at the time I wrote my column yesterday afternoon, I think 100,000 people had signed the petition. It's now at nearly 500,000. My personal view is if we're not going to honour a Prime Minister who won 3 terms, I think is the only Labour Prime Ministers who have won an election in almost half a century, then I don't really know who we are going to honour from the most senior ranks of public service. I think he probably does deserve it. But I think it's actually a good opportunity to assess his legacy and to think about how he continues to affect public life and British life in general today.
There's talk of a legacy suggests he's left the stage, but actually, as you point out in your column, he hasn't, whether it's through the institute that he runs and manages, his interventions on COVID, even the fact the Labour Party seems to be swinging, the sort of swingometer is taking us back to the Blairites away from the Corbyn era. He never left us.
No, that's right. And I mean, I think Peter Mandelson is still writing in the papers and advising Keir Starmer on where to take the Labour Party. I mean, I think what I tried to say in my column today, if you look at some of the really big legal frameworks that govern a lot of our life today, whether that's the Human Rights Act or the Equality Act, and quite often these are the legal frameworks that cause various problems that Conservatives are often railing against and trying to look for solutions. Those legal frameworks date back to the Blair government. The Equality Act was prepared and promised under him, but was passed under Gordon Brown. But those big legal frameworks go back to those New Labour years. And if Conservatives really are chafing against some of the problems with the culture wars or in the criminal justice system or our inability to deal with the problems in the asylum system, then we ought to be having a debate about what we do about those big legal frameworks.
I mean, those are deep tectonic shifts, aren't they? The Equalities Act, you could argue. I mean, I know that the culture wars are a global phenomenon, but in this country, the Equality Act ushered in. It's felt like it's ushered in an era of identity politics. You mentioned asylum policy. I mean, you think back to the early years of well, not the early years, the sort of mid-years of the Blair premiership and some of those Home Office estimates about the number of Eastern European nationals who would come to the UK, grotesquely off as those estimates were. And there's a sense in which immigration policy under Blair has transformed Britain. I mean, these are big changes under his premiership.
Yeah, huge changes. I mean, I think if you look at British history, we sometimes had negative net migration where more people left the country than came into the country. And before Tony Blair was elected, the highest level of net migration at that point had been in 1994 when it was 77,000. In Blair's first year, those numbers almost doubled. And they just carried on rising from there. And we've had net migration, over 100,000, over 150,000, over 200,000, sometimes even over 300,000 in a single calendar year. And that was a deliberate policy brought about by Blair and members of his government. The first thing they did was, or one of the first things they did was scrap the primary purpose rule in the immigration system. The asylum system was out of control when, I think in his first term, he chose not to introduce the transitional controls for the new EU member states. And then, as we say, we've mentioned the Human Rights Act. That's one of the reasons why we find it difficult to enforce removals of illegal immigrants and foreign criminals. So the numbers on immigration were down to a series of very deliberate decisions. And what's happened since under Conservative governments of different forms is that the Conservatives have promised to try to reduce immigration. They've never really got to grips with it. I think partly because the Blair policies helped to make our economy kind of addicted to these huge numbers of people coming into the country.
Was it more than that? I'll move on from immigration shortly, but if you listen to someone like Peter Hitchens, he will say it was more than just business being addicted to cheap labour. It was overtly, actually no, it wasn't overtly, it was covertly ideological. People like Barbara Roach, the then Home Office Minister, were part of a cadre under Blair who wanted to change Britain in a way that would stick it to the Tories.
Yeah, I think I remember Barbara Roach, when she was appointed immigration minister, said she was appalled at the very idea of taking the job because she didn't really believe in controlling immigration. And that does reflect a mentality on the left and in that New Labour period. And I think it was one of Tony Blair's former speechwriters who said that there was a deliberate attempt to increase immigration because they wanted increased diversity and to rub the right noses in that diversity. There's definitely a support for high immigration because of economic policies and economic thinking, but there's also a kind of philosophical thing that exists among the kind of liberals of all parties, but in particular on the left, that a country is just some kind of platform upon which anybody in the world can come to live and work, when I think conservatives like me would say a country is so much more, and you have to, we inherit traditions and cultures and institutions of a country, and it's our obligation with each generation to make sure it's handed on to the next one in good health.
I remember covering the 2001 election with the Blair battle bus and seeing Tony Blair up close. I remember reading his autobiography and thinking, this is a man who really suits power. And yet, when you say the words Tony Blair now, Nick, to people, you get that kind of reaction that you sometimes see. I can think of a couple of my friends. When you say Margaret Thatcher, who also won 3 terms, you get this sort of reflexive reaction of indignation and fury, and it almost defies logic a little bit. I mean, I get why people are furious about things like the Iraq War. I'm sort of more furious about immigration policy and the Equality Act, which you mentioned, which I think has left a long-term legacy that we're struggling to cope with. But why is it so personal? Why do people feel so vehemently opposed to Tony Blair, the man?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I actually don't think there was this a hatred and highly emotional response to him when he first departed as Prime Minister. It feels like it's something that has grown over time. And there might be different reasons for that, whether the full effects of his policies maybe came to light for some people later. It might be the changes in the Labour Party, where the left of the Labour Party, seized power and now feels much more confident and emboldened. But it's certainly true. I mean, I would say that Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher are the 2 most consequential leaders our country has had in the last half century, and it is true that if you mention their names to large numbers of people, then the reaction is pretty extreme, whether it's positive or negative.